In order to validate the amount field in the add transaction view, we are going to specify the different rules for validating our entries throughout the app, and amount entry is one of them. So every validation rule will be presented through this iValidation rule interface. The interface has one property for specifying the validation message. In our case, the amount should be greater than 0 because we don't support the negative transactions, and we will specify that in the validation message. The other part of the validation rule is the check message. So every implementation of this iValidation rule within this check method will have the custom logic for checking whether or not this rule is satisfied. Maybe the best thing is to show you how to implement this interface. So for amount entry, we will have the non-negative rule. So this implements iValidation rule, and type of our amount is going to be decimal. Let's implement this interface. So validation message, we will provide that in the add transaction view model, and just simply in our check, we are going to check that the value we provided is greater than 0. So how to use this and all other rules? So for that, we define the validatable object. This is a bindable object, meaning that it raises on property changed event, and our amount property is going to be type of the validatable object. Let's just quickly go through the properties this class has. This validatable object and iValidation rule is provided in the code snippets lecture of the resources section. So you can go to the Git and copy and paste this and iValidation rule. You just need to change the namespace to match this. Back to the validatable object. It has the list of validation. So every object can have one or more validation rules. In our case, amount, it's only going to have one rule, but we can also add a rule that the amount can't be greater than, let's say, 1000, and then we add all those rules to this list. So we get the list of the errors from these validation rules. Every object has its value and is valid property. So once we are ready to perform some action, meaning when we are ready to add a new transaction, what we will do is to call the validate method. And in this method, we go and check all our rules. If we have some errors, we write that to the errors property, and the object is valid if there is no errors, but we also return this is valid property. At first sight, this might be overcomplication, and you might be wondering why we are doing this. We can just set this rule in the view model and check the amount entry. This is true, but what we are getting here is the entire logic to have multiple rules against one property, and they will be displayed accordingly. But also what we can do is to reuse some of those rules. You're going to see in the later sections when we need to implement the validation whether or not the email address is valid or not. For that, we will use the regex, and in order to avoid having that regex all over the place, we will define the rule whether or not a text inserted in the entry is an actual email address or not. And that email address entry is going to have several rules. So it's going to have rule whether or not the entry is empty, And the second rule is to check whether the actual text is the email address format.